Black woman's first-class seat stolen. What happens next shocks everyone. Monique Harris stood her ground, the tension in the first-class cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. She had paid for this seat, and she wasn't going anywhere. Captain Larson, a seasoned pilot with a reputation for fairness, arrived to assess the situation. His calm demeanor and direct questioning exposed the truth, the so-called VIP. Greg had no valid ticket. Monique's boarding pass was legitimate, and the reassignment had been a manipulation of the airline's policy. Passengers, emboldened by Monique's courage, began sharing their own stories of unjust reassignments. A pattern emerged, exposing a quiet but persistent bias. Captain Larson didn't just resolve the seating dispute, he called the airline's headquarters directly, demanding accountability. Within minutes, corporate confirmed Monique's seat was rightfully hers, and Greg was escorted to the back of the plane. As Monique settled into seat 2B, the passengers erupted in applause. Her victory was not just a personal win, but a statement against systemic injustice. The story didn't end when the plane landed. Monique used the momentum to launch a movement advocating for equality and respect in the travel industry. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, drop a 1 in the comments, subscribe, and share to help amplify voices that deserve to be heard. Your support fuels stories of justice and change. Together, we can make a difference. Monique Harris, a 34-year-old successful Black entrepreneur, stepped onto the plane bound for San Francisco with a sense of well-earned relief. After a week of high-stakes business negotiations in Chicago, she was finally heading home. Her company had just secured a pivotal contract, a milestone she had worked tirelessly for. Monique had treated herself to a first-class ticket, not as a luxury, but as a well-deserved reward for her perseverance. As she clutched her boarding pass for seat 2B, she allowed herself a small smile, ready to enjoy a rare moment of comfort and tranquility. Monique's mind drifted as she navigated the bustling jet bridge. Her heels tapped rhythmically against the metal, a subtle echo of the power she had commanded in boardrooms all week. She had fought hard to build her business from the ground up, often being the only woman, let alone the only Black woman, in the room. Each step forward in her career had been earned through grit and resilience, pushing past countless closed doors and dismissive glances. This first-class seat wasn't just a ticket, it was a symbol of everything she had overcome. It was a rare chance to sit back, sip a glass of champagne, and celebrate her wins. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone last night, filled with pride. "You did it, Monique. You always do." The thought warmed her, and as she reached the plane's threshold, she took a deep, steadying breath. This was her moment, a brief respite before diving back into the whirlwind of work and responsibility. In the back of her mind, Monique knew how rare it was for someone like her to get these moments. She had learned to cherish them, to hold on to them tightly, because peace was often fleeting. The first-class cabin gleamed with polished surfaces and soft leather seats. The subtle hum of conversation mixed with the faint clink of glasses as flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Monique moved through the aisle with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning for row 2.2. She was surrounded by the usual first-class crowd, businessmen typing furiously on laptops, a woman reviewing presentation slides, and a couple already dozing under cashmere blankets. Her eyes landed on seat 2B, right by the window, just as she had requested. She felt a small thrill of anticipation at the thought of curling up with a good book and disconnecting from the world. She adjusted the strap of her designer tote and stepped forward, only to stop short. A man was already sitting in her seat. He looked entirely at home, dressed in an expensive gray suit, his hair slicked back with precision. A newspaper lay open on his lap, and he appeared completely engrossed, as if the rest of the world didn't exist. Monique glanced down at her boarding pass, the bold 2B staring back at her. She had double-checked her ticket at the gate. There was no mistake. "Excuse me?" Monique said, her voice polite but firm. "I believe this is my seat." The man barely looked up, his eyes darting over the edge of his newspaper. "I don't think so," he replied, his tone clipped and dismissive. He turned a page with a practiced nonchalance, signaling the conversation was over before it had even begun. Monique's polite smile faded. "I'm sure of it," she said, holding out her ticket. "Seat 2B. He sighed, finally lowering the newspaper. His expression was a mix of annoyance and disbelief, as if the mere suggestion that he might be in the wrong seat was absurd. "Look, miss," he said, his voice dropping. "I was told I could sit here. Why don't you take it up with the staff?" A flicker of irritation sparked in Monique's chest. The man's attitude was more than just arrogance, it was entitlement. She turned to the nearest flight attendant, a young woman with a name tag that read Jessica. "There seems to be a mistake," Monique said, keeping her voice level. "I'm assigned to seat 2B, but someone else is already sitting here." Jessica's practiced smile wavered. She took Monique's ticket, glanced at the screen on her tablet, and hesitated. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Harris," she said, her voice softer now. "It appears there's been a reassignment. Your new seat is in economy." A stunned silence hung between them. Monique's hand tightened around the strap of her bag. This was not a simple mistake. Something was very wrong. Monique took a slow, steadying breath and tried again. "Sir, this is my assigned seat. If there's been a mistake, I'm sure we can sort it out." Greg barely shifted in his seat. His eyes remained on his magazine, his fingers flipping a page as if her words had been nothing more than background noise. "I already told you," he muttered. "I was told to sit here. Maybe you should double-check your ticket." The dismissiveness in his tone was like a slap. Monique straightened, her expression calm but her voice sharpening. "I did check. This is my seat. I'd appreciate it if you would let me sit down." This time Greg did look up. His expression was a mix of impatience and amusement, as if this exchange was an inconvenience he would soon laugh about over cocktails. "Look, lady," he said, "I'm not moving. You should go find a flight attendant." Without another word, Monique turned away and caught Jessica's eye. The young flight attendant hurried over, her practiced smile already faltering as Monique handed her the ticket. "There seems to be a mistake," Monique explained. "My seat is occupied." Jessica's eyes darted between Monique, Greg, and the ticket. She pulled out her tablet, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. The more she looked, the more her expression shifted, from confusion to unease. "I'm so sorry, Miss Harris," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "It looks like there was a reassignment." Monique's brows knitted together. "A reassignment? By whom?" Jessica hesitated, a slight flush rising on her cheeks. "I'm not sure. The system sometimes makes automatic adjustments for last-minute changes." "And my new seat?" Monique asked, her voice still measured. Jessica cleared her throat. It's in economy." For a moment, Monique didn't respond. The words hung in the air, heavy and wrong. "I paid for first class," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "I booked this seat weeks ago." "I understand," Jessica said quickly. "It must be a system error. Let me get the flight manager." Monique nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as Jessica hurried away. Around her, a few passengers were openly watching now. A woman in the next row leaned toward her husband, whispering. A man across the aisle glanced up from his laptop, his expression unreadable. Her pulse quickened, but Monique forced herself to remain still. She had been here before, in places where she was treated as if she didn't belong, where her presence was questioned. Her mind raced back to a conference last year when security had mistaken her for a staff member, not the keynote speaker. She remembered the way they had asked for her ID, the way their eyes had shifted when they realized who she was. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. She would not let that happen again. Not here, not now. A few minutes later, a tall man in a crisp navy suit approached. His name tag read Michael, and his expression was a practiced mix of professionalism and impatience. He moved with the air of someone who had already decided this conversation was an inconvenience. "Ms. Harris," he began, his tone smooth and clipped. I understand there's a seating issue? Yes, Monique replied, her voice steady. I was assigned seat 2B. My ticket is confirmed, but I'm being told there's been a reassignment to economy without my consent. Michael offered a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. It appears there was a last-minute VIP request. Sometimes the system makes adjustments. I apologize for the inconvenience. Monique's expression didn't waver. I paid for this seat. I'm not moving to economy. His smile thinned, and he glanced around as if searching for a quick exit. I understand your frustration, but we need to get everyone settled so we can take off on time. Perhaps you could take the economy seat just for this flight, and we'll make sure you're compensated. Her voice remained even. No, thank you. I would like the seat I paid for. A flicker of irritation crossed Michael's face, but he masked it quickly. Miss Harris, we really need your cooperation to avoid holding up the flight. If you'd just take your new seat, we can resolve this quickly. Monique met his gaze directly. The quickest resolution is for the person in my seat to move. Around them, the atmosphere in the cabin grew taut. Some passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the confrontation. A middle-aged couple in matching vacation gear exchanged wary looks. The man with the laptop had put it away, his attention now fully on the exchange. A woman across the aisle, perhaps in her 20s, watched with a different expression. She was black, with box braids pulled back into a neat bun. Her eyes met Monique's, and she gave the smallest of nods, a silent, powerful gesture of support. But others weren't as kind. A businessman in the front row sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as if this situation were a personal inconvenience. A flight attendant near the galley fidgeted, her hands twisting a napkin until it tore. Monique saw it all, each reaction adding weight to the moment. She knew what some of them were thinking. Why is she making this a big deal? Can't she just take the seat and be quiet? But she also knew that backing down now would mean swallowing yet another small injustice. And if there was one thing Monique Harris had learned, it was that small injustices, left unchecked, had a way of piling up until they became insurmountable. She set her bag down on the edge of the armrest, a quiet signal that she was not going anywhere. I'd like to speak to the captain, she said. Now. Michael hesitated, his practiced smile faltering for the first time. Monique maintained her composure, but her voice carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around them. If this can't be resolved here, I'd be more than happy to make a call to your corporate office, she said, pulling her phone from her bag. I have their number saved, and I'm sure they'd be interested to know why a confirmed first-class ticket holder is being forced into economy. A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Michael's expression tightened, and he glanced over his shoulder as if hoping for backup. That won't be necessary, Ms. Harris. I'm sure we can sort this out. Then let's do that, Monique interrupted smoothly. With the captain, if you please. Michael's jaw clenched, but he nodded curtly. I'll get him. The cabin fell into a tense silence as he walked away. Monique remained standing, her posture a quiet assertion of control. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, each set of eyes a mixture of curiosity, discomfort, or quiet approval. When Captain Larson arrived, his presence shifted the atmosphere immediately. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a steady gaze that commanded respect. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor calm but authoritative. What seems to be the problem? He asked, his voice measured as he looked from Monique to Michael. Monique held out her ticket. I paid for seat 2B. I've been told it was reassigned without my consent, and I'm being asked to move to economy. Captain Larson took the ticket, his expression unchanging as he examined it. He turned to Michael. Why was this passenger's seat reassigned? There was a last-minute VIP request, Michael explained, his voice tight. The system adjusted the seating automatically. Captain Larson's gaze remained steady. Who is the VIP? Michael hesitated, his silence stretching a little too long. The captain's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. I'd like to see this VIP's ticket, please, he said. Greg, who had remained silent through the entire exchange, finally lowered his magazine. His confidence seemed to wane as Captain Larson's attention shifted to him. I don't have a printed ticket," Greg said, his voice wavering slightly. "They told me I could sit here." "Who told you that?" Captain Larson asked, his tone still calm, but with an edge that cut through any pretense. Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced at Michael, searching for an ally, but found none. The truth hung heavy in the air, and everyone on the plane seemed to hold their breath. Captain Larson turned back to Monique, his voice firm. "Ms. Harris, your seat is yours. Please make yourself comfortable." "Mr. Thompson," he addressed Greg, "you'll need to return to your assigned seat immediately." Monique exhaled slowly, a small victory in a battle that felt much larger than a seat assignment. She nodded at the captain, her gratitude evident but unspoken. As Greg rose and shuffled toward the back of the plane, a new kind of silence filled the cabin. The quiet that comes when truth stands taller than comfort. As Greg shuffled down the aisle, the whispers among the passengers grew louder. Monique could hear snippets of conversations, words like unfair, ridiculous, and saw this coming. Her senses were on high alert, every glance and murmur reinforcing what she already suspected. This wasn't an isolated incident. There was a pattern here, a thread of injustice, weaving through the polite facade of the first-class cabin. Captain Larson remained where he stood, his expression calm but unyielding. He turned back to Michael, his voice steady. "I'd like to know who approved this reassignment." Michael's professional veneer began to crack. He glanced around, as if looking for an escape route. "It was a system error," he repeated, the words sounding hollow. "The system sometimes reallocates seats for VIP." "And Mr. Thompson is a VIP?" Captain Larson asked, his tone sharpening. "Well," Michael stammered, he requested an upgrade at the gate. There was an open seat, so—" "An open seat?" Monique interjected. "You mean the seat I paid for?" A ripple of agreement swept through the cabin. The woman across the aisle, who had offered Monique a nod earlier, leaned forward. "I had a friend this happened to. Same airline, same excuse," she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by those around her. A man a few rows back spoke up next. "My brother was bumped last month. He's a quiet guy, didn't want to make a fuss. They told him it was a system error, too." The air thickened with unease. Michael's discomfort was now palpable, his carefully managed expression slipping into something closer to panic. Captain Larson crossed his arms over his chest, a physical barrier that blocked any attempt at deflection. "If this is a system issue, it seems to be a persistent one. I'll need to see the records of this so-called VIP request." Monique watched, her pulse steady but her senses sharp. She had spent years navigating boardrooms filled with people who underestimated her, people who assumed she would fold under pressure. But this was different. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defending every name, every voice that had been quietly silenced by the same excuse. Captain Larson's voice cut through the rising noise. "Until this is clarified, Ms. Harris will remain in her assigned seat. If anyone else has experienced a similar situation, I encourage you to speak up." A murmur of agreement rose, a low hum of solidarity. Monique settled into her seat, but her victory felt tentative. The energy in the cabin had shifted, but the battle wasn't over. There was more to this story, and Monique had the unsettling feeling that the truth was only beginning to unravel. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the tension in the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Jessica approached Monique cautiously, her eyes darting around to ensure they weren't being watched. She knelt slightly beside Monique's seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something," Jessica began, her hands twisting the fabric of her uniform. "This isn't the first time this has happened." Monique's expression remained calm, but her grip on the armrest tightened. "What do you mean?" Jessica hesitated, a flash of fear crossing her face. "There's a list. The flight managers have access to it. It's not official, not on any records, but I've seen it. It tracks passengers who are more likely to be reassigned or bumped, mostly people of color. They say it's for security or priority adjustments, but it's always the same kind of passengers. Monique's stomach twisted. How do you know? Jessica glanced over her shoulder again, then pulled a small, worn notebook from her apron pocket. I started keeping track. I knew it wasn't right, but I was afraid to say anything. People who speak up, they don't last long. She handed the notebook to Monique, her hands trembling. Monique opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the pages. Each line was a record of a seat reassignment, a name, a flight number, and a brief note: paid for first class, moved to economy. The names read like a roll call of injustice. Mostly black and brown passengers, their experiences reduced to a few scribbled words. Monique's shock gave way to a cold, determined anger. She had thought this might be an isolated incident, a single uncomfortable situation, but this was systemic. This was deliberate. She flipped through the pages, her mind already piecing together the broader picture. Each name, each note, was a story. And now she had proof. Jessica's voice was small but resolute. I didn't know who to tell, but when I saw what happened to you, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Monique met her eyes, seeing both fear and courage reflected back at her. You did the right thing. I'm not going to let this go. For the first time, Jessica managed a weak smile. I'll help you, whatever you need. Monique nodded, slipping the notebook into her bag. She had come onto this plane expecting a few hours of peace, but now she had a mission. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about exposing a system that thought it could get away with erasing people, one seat at a time. Monique's mind shifted into strategy mode. She opened her phone's camera and carefully photographed each page of Jessica's notebook. The dim airplane lighting cast shadows across the handwritten notes, but she made sure every detail was legible. She also activated her voice recorder, tucking the phone discreetly under her scarf to capture the surrounding conversations. Her instincts told her to gather as much evidence as possible. She knew how quickly narratives could be twisted, how easily the truth could be buried under corporate jargon and carefully constructed apologies. Monique typed a quick message to a trusted colleague back home, attaching the photos. Hold on to these. I might need them soon. Her hands trembled slightly as she hit send. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was the weight of knowing what might come next. She had seen it before. Whistleblowers discredited, dissenters silenced, those who stood up often left standing alone. But the thought of staying quiet, of letting this moment pass like countless others, made her feel hollow. If she didn't push back, who would? A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. Excuse me. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a weathered denim jacket leaned into Monique's row. I couldn't help but overhear. Something like this happened to my daughter last month. She had a confirmed seat, but when she boarded, they'd moved her to the back of the plane. They said it was a system error, too. Monique nodded, the validation strengthening her resolve. Did she report it? The woman shook her head. She didn't want to make a scene. She thought maybe it was just bad luck. Another voice chimed in. My brother had the same issue. They bumped him without an explanation. He's too polite to push back, but it felt wrong. Monique's heart pounded with both dread and hope. These were not isolated incidents. The pattern was undeniable. She looked at the faces around her. Some wary, some sympathetic, some openly curious. She had always believed in the power of a story, in the strength of a truth told loud enough. Now, with the voices of those around her joining the chorus, she knew the story was no longer hers alone. She turned to Jessica, who stood a few steps away, looking small and uncertain. We need to get more stories. The truth can't just be whispered anymore. It needs to be heard. Jessica nodded, her fear giving way to a quiet determination. Monique wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had been quietly, systematically silenced. Monique watched as Michael slipped into the galley, his expression a mask of forced calm. Jessica had been arranging drinks, her back to him, when he leaned in close, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "You need to stop talking," he said, his words sharp and quick. "Whatever you think you know, you don't. Keep your mouth shut if you want to keep this job." Jessica froze, her hands tightening around the edge of the beverage cart. "But, no buts," Michael cut her off, his voice barely more than a whisper but dripping with menace. "You've seen what happens to people who make trouble. You're not special. They'll make you disappear." Monique, standing just around the corner, had her phone's camera trained through the narrow gap between the seats. The screen glowed with the red recording icon. Her pulse was steady, her breathing even, but every muscle in her body was poised to act. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The sound made Michael straighten, his expression shifting from anger to a false, professional smile as he turned to face her. "Is everything all right here?" Monique's voice carried through the small space, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. Michael's eyes darted to her phone, the camera still recording. "Ms. Harris, this is a private conversation," he said, his tone struggling to stay polite. "It doesn't sound very private," Monique replied, her voice unshakable. "It sounds like you're threatening an employee who did nothing wrong except tell the truth." Jessica's eyes widened, a mix of fear and relief. Passengers craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the exchange. A few phones were already pointed in their direction, tiny red lights blinking, capturing every word. Michael's mask of composure cracked. "Ms. Harris, I suggest you sit down before you create a disturbance." Monique didn't move. "A disturbance?" She raised her voice just enough to carry over the hum of the engines. "You mean like denying someone the seat they paid for, or keeping a list of passengers to downgrade based on their race?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear. The energy in the cabin shifted. What had been whispers turned into murmurs, a low wave of sound building behind her. More phones were raised, screens glowing, passengers recording not just a confrontation, but a reckoning. Michael's confidence dissolved. He glanced around, the walls closing in, his power slipping away with every camera lens that turned toward him. Monique took a step closer, her phone held steady and delivered the final blow. "If you have nothing to hide, Michael, why are you so afraid of the truth being recorded?" A ripple of movement drew attention as Captain Larson approached, his expression unreadable but his stride purposeful. The murmurs quieted, leaving only the low hum of the plane engines. He stopped beside Monique, his presence a wall of quiet strength between her and Michael. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. Monique remained silent, allowing Michael to dig his own grave. His expression flickered with panic, but he forced a smile. "Just a misunderstanding, Captain. Miss Harris was confused about her seating arrangement. We're resolving it now." Captain Larson's gaze didn't shift. "I've already reviewed the situation, Michael, and I think Miss Harris deserves the truth." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and opened it with deliberate precision. "This is an internal memo sent to senior staff last month. It outlines a policy of selective seat reassignments to accommodate certain priority passengers. Specifically, it advises discretion when reassigning seats from passengers who are, and I quote, less likely to cause disruption. A phrase I believe you've used before. The air in the cabin turned electric. Michael's composure shattered. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Around them, passengers began whispering again, their tones shifting from confusion to indignation. A woman in the aisle seat turned to her neighbor. "I knew it! They did the same thing to my sister last month." A young man in a business suit leaned forward. "This isn't just a mistake, is it? They're doing this on purpose." The weight of the revelation pressed down on Michael. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He tried to reclaim his authority, but every attempt only exposed more of his desperation. "This is being blown out of proportion," he sputtered. We have policies, procedures. It's not what it looks like." Monique took a breath, steadying herself. She looked not just at Michael, but at everyone around her. The passengers, the flight crew, Jessica still holding the drink cart with white-knuckled hands. "It is exactly what it looks like," she said, her voice even but edged with raw truth. "It looks like a system designed to keep certain people in their place, to make sure that comfort, that respect, is a privilege, not a right." Her words flowed naturally, not rehearsed but drawn from a well of lived experience. "I'm not just standing up for myself. I'm standing up for everyone who has been told to be quiet, to not make a scene, to accept less because that's all they think we deserve. We pay the same prices. We follow the same rules. We deserve the same respect." The plane was silent. Every eye was on her, every ear tuned to her words. Monique's voice did not waver. It filled the space, not with anger but with an undeniable strength. "The only way things change is when we stop accepting excuses and start demanding accountability. When we choose not to stay silent." The passengers seemed to breathe as one, a collective exhale of something heavy and unspoken. And in that moment, Monique knew the story had shifted. It was no longer just her fight. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt invisible. Captain Larson unfolded the memo, the crisp sound of paper slicing through the heavy silence of the cabin. His voice remained steady as he began to read, but the words themselves were anything but. "Priority seating adjustments," he recited. "Effective immediately, senior flight management may reassign seating to accommodate VIP and priority passengers. In cases of limited availability, discretion is advised when selecting which passengers to reassign. Priority should be given to those less likely to create public incidents or complaints. Discretion is key." He paused, letting the weight of the phrase settle over the audience. The memo also mentions keeping certain passengers unaware of changes until boarding is complete and ensuring that adjustments do not appear targeted. It advises staff to avoid documenting reasons for reassignments in writing, to maintain operational flexibility. A wave of murmur spread through the cabin. The language of the memo was clear, clinical, crafted by lawyers and executives to sound professional while disguising something far more insidious. It wasn't just a system error, it was a policy, a deliberate strategy to decide who mattered and who did not. Monique felt the shift immediately. Passengers who had been silent began to find their voices. A man a few rows back, his salt and pepper hair and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the look of a professor, spoke up. "This happened to me last year. I was moved to the back of the plane despite having a confirmed first-class ticket. They told me it was a scheduling conflict." A woman across the aisle nodded vigorously. "My daughter too. She was traveling alone and they bumped her without explanation. She's only 16 and they made her feel like she'd done something wrong." A young couple near the front added their story. "We were flying for our honeymoon. Same airline, same excuse. System error. They separated us and moved us both to middle seats in economy." Jessica, still standing near Monique, drew a breath and added her voice. "I've seen this before. I've been told to reassign seats without a reason. I always thought it was just bad luck, but now I see the pattern." One by one, voices rose from every corner of the cabin. Each story was a thread, and together they wove a tapestry of systematic bias. The truth that had been hidden under layers of excuses and quiet reassignments now filled the space, undeniable and sharp-edged. Captain Larson let the passengers speak. He did not rush them, did not interrupt. His stance, arms crossed over his chest and eyes focused, made it clear that he was not just a figure of authority, but an ally. His expression remained serious, a quiet acknowledgement of the gravity of what was unfolding. The collective voices were not just recounting experiences, they were building a case. What had started as a single moment of injustice had become a rallying cry. The walls of the plane seemed to pulse with a shared heartbeat, a rhythm of truth and resistance. Monique could feel it, the swell of something larger than herself. She knew now that this story wouldn't end when the plane landed. It was only just beginning. Michael's face had lost all its practiced composure. His once confident smirk was now a tight line, his jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. The weight of the memo and the voices of the passengers had shattered his control, leaving him exposed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His authority, once absolute, had dissolved into thin air. A flight attendant approached quietly, her expression a mix of discomfort and duty. "Sir, Captain Larson has requested that you step off the plane," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. Michael looked at her, then at Captain Larson, who met his gaze with unwavering resolve. He seemed to shrink under the eyes of the passengers, every phone camera still recording, every witness now an archivist of his downfall. His walk down the aisle was slow, each step dragging like a confession. People turned away from him, a physical rejection of his actions. When he reached the exit, he glanced back only once, his expression a mix of disbelief and fear. The door closed behind him with a definitive thud. Jessica stepped forward, her movements tentative but purposeful. She stood next to Monique, her shoulders back, and faced the passengers, who had witnessed everything. "I need to say something," she began, her voice cracking slightly. "I've been part of this system for too long. I saw things that didn't feel right, and I stayed quiet because I was afraid. Today I see how dangerous silence can be. I'm so sorry for what happened, for what's happened to so many of you. I won't be silent anymore." Her words rippled through the cabin, breaking the last remnants of tension. Someone began to clap, a single steady beat that spread like wildfire. Soon, the applause was a wave, washing over Jessica, lifting her from fear to redemption. She blinked back tears, a smile breaking through as she realized this was not just an end, but a beginning. Monique sat down slowly, the leather of the seat cool against her skin. Her hand rested on the armrest, fingers brushing over the polished metal. It was just a seat, just a place on a plane. But at that moment, it felt like a victory. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been told to move, to wait, to accept less than they deserved. She looked around, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had spoken up, who had shared their stories and stood with her. The plane felt smaller now, not because of its size, but because of the connection that had woven through the rows. She had come on this flight looking for rest, but she had found something much more valuable: a chance to make things right. Monique closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deeply. This wasn't just about reclaiming her seat. It was about reclaiming the right to be seen, to be heard, and to be treated with respect. And as the plane hummed steadily through the sky, she knew that when they landed, the story would not stay on board. It would travel far beyond, spreading like light through the cracks of a long-closed door. Monique wasted no time once the plane touched down. She moved with a clear purpose, her phone buzzing with messages from fellow passengers who had recorded the incident. Captain Larson and Jessica stood by her side as they navigated the terminal, their expressions a mix of resolve and anticipation. They found a quiet corner away from the crowd, and Monique began drafting emails to civil rights groups, legal advisors, and media outlets. Captain Larson provided her with internal documents, including the memo that outlined the discriminatory seating policy. "I've seen things over the years," he admitted quietly. "I always thought it was just bad management, but this is different. I'm ready to testify if it comes to that." Jessica nodded, her voice stronger than before. "I'll share everything I've documented. I want to make sure this never happens again. To anyone." Monique's legal team mobilized quickly. They saw not just a clear case of individual discrimination, but a class action opportunity. They reached out to passengers who had shared similar experiences, building a coalition of voices that could not be ignored. It wasn't just about monetary compensation, it was about accountability, transparency, and dismantling a system that thrived on selective silence. The first video hit social media only hours after they landed. The clip showed Monique standing tall in the first-class cabin, her voice calm but firm as she demanded answers. It captured Captain Larson reading the internal memo and Jessica bravely sharing her experiences. The video spread rapidly, picked up by major news outlets and shared by influencers who recognized the broader implications of the story. People began sharing their own experiences under the hashtag #RightfulSeat, recounting moments when they had been bumped, dismissed, or made to feel less than. The stories came from all over airports, hotels, workplaces, revealing a network of quiet injustices that had become normalized. Monique's story became a catalyst, sparking a conversation that was no longer just about an airline, but about how marginalized communities were treated in everyday situations. National news channels invited Monique to speak. She sat on morning shows, her voice steady as she recounted what had happened, always steering the conversation back to the bigger picture. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane," she told a reporter. "It's about who gets to feel safe and valued, and who is told they need to accept less." Under the pressure of public scrutiny, the airlines scrambled to control the damage. Their first response was a lukewarm apology, a press release filled with corporate jargon about system errors and training opportunities. But the public wasn't buying it. The videos, the testimonies, and the undeniable evidence of the memo turned the tide against them. The airline's stock began to drop. Shareholders demanded answers. Executives who had overseen the discriminatory policies were placed on administrative leave, and eventually a few were forced to resign. The CEO issued a public apology, not from a polished boardroom, but from a modest podium, facing a crowd of journalists armed with hard questions. Monique and her legal team pressed forward with the lawsuit. It wasn't just about money. It was about setting a precedent. They pushed for policy changes, mandatory anti-discrimination training, and a public acknowledgement of the harm caused. When the airline settled, it was with more than just a financial payout. They agreed to overhaul their seating policies and to create a fund to support diversity initiatives in the travel industry. Jessica found a new calling in the aftermath. She left the airline and joined a nonprofit focused on workers' rights, using her story as a tool to help others speak up. She became a voice for those who were afraid to step forward, offering guidance and support to employees navigating difficult workplace dynamics. Her redemption arc wasn't just a personal victory, it was a chance to give back in a way that mattered. Monique's platform grew exponentially. She became a sought-after speaker at conferences, a guest on podcasts, and a leader in online forums dedicated to fighting discrimination. But she kept her focus clear. This wasn't about fame, it was about impact. She partnered with advocacy groups, helping to amplify the voices of those who were often unheard. She used her story not as an endpoint, but as a springboard to elevate others. Every step forward felt like reclaiming ground that had been lost, not just for her, but for all those who had been quietly reassigned, who had taken a lesser seat, who had swallowed the bitter pill of discrimination with a forced smile. Monique made sure the story did not fade. She turned it into a movement, showing that a single moment of injustice could spark a lasting change. Monique stood at the podium, a row of microphones pointed toward her, the soft hum of cameras capturing every moment. The room was filled with reporters, community leaders, and familiar faces from the flight that had sparked it all. Her expression was calm, but beneath the surface was a deep well of gratitude and determination. "I want to start by thanking everyone who stood with me," she began, her voice steady. From Captain Larson, who chose integrity over silence, to Jessica, who had the courage to step forward when it mattered most, and to all the passengers who shared their own stories. Your voices turned this from an isolated incident into a movement. Monique paused, letting her words settle. This isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about who gets to feel respected and valued. It's about challenging systems that have quietly pushed too many aside for too long. Real change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when one person speaks up and another joins them, and another, until the truth is too loud to ignore. The audience erupted in applause. Monique nodded, a small but powerful acknowledgement of the collective strength in the room. This was no longer just her story. It was theirs. Over the following months, Monique built a network of support, connecting with those who had reached out to share their experiences. She listened to stories from all walks of life, from different industries and backgrounds, and each story strengthened her resolve. She created a platform where people could share their voices safely, advocating not just for airline policies to change, but for broader reforms in how corporations handled discrimination and bias. Through online forums, community events, and advocacy campaigns, Monique fostered a sense of belonging. She wanted everyone who had ever felt unseen to know that they were not alone. Her platform wasn't just a place to vent frustrations, it became a launchpad for real action, helping people connect with legal resources, workplace support, and mental health services. At her final event of the year, Monique stood before a packed auditorium. Her speech was not scripted, but every word came from a place of truth. When faced with injustice, will you sit quietly and let it happen, or will you rise, speak out, and demand the respect you deserve? She asked, her gaze moving across the room. The choice is yours, but remember, every time you speak up, you're giving someone else the courage to do the same. Her words resonated. People in the audience nodded. Some wiped away tears, and others raised their phones to capture the moment. Monique's message was clear. Change didn't need to start with grand gestures. It could start with a single voice. As the event drew to a close, Monique took a step back, allowing the crowd's energy to fill the space. She had started this journey fighting for a single seat on a plane, but now she was fighting for everyone who had ever been told to move, to wait, or to accept less. She had turned a moment of personal injustice into a movement for systemic change. And now she extended an invitation to everyone watching and listening. If this story moved you, if it sparked a thought or a feeling, please consider joining our community by subscribing. Your support helps amplify voices that need to be heard. We're stronger together, and every voice matters. Her gratitude was genuine. Thank you for being here. For every like, comment, and share. Together we can make sure stories like mine lead to real-world impact. Stay strong, stay vocal, and remember, change begins with us. As the lights dimmed and the audience rose to their feet, Monique knew this was not the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The movement had found its voice, and it would continue to echo long after the applause had faded.